At the end of the day, if the grid cannot absorb that demand, that is your single point of failure.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we imagine how we can be better versions of ourselves and build a collective future we actually want to live in. The increasing electrification of everything, from vehicles and buildings and even industrial processes, is putting unprecedented strain on the electrical grid. Utilities and grid operators are grappling with this challenge of balancing fluctuating demands, especially as renewable energy sources become more prevalent and that the complexity of the grid expands. And then you have the rise of EV adoption that is then further amplifying this challenge. Our aging grid wasn't designed to, have widespread EVs charging on it. And so upgrading the grids to meet this demand isn't going to be cheap. And today's guest, in fact, estimates that U.S. utilities will need to invest upwards of $19 billion in grid edge service transformer upgrades nationwide to support projected EV growth by 2030. That's a lot of money. However, they also say that managed charging could reduce these costs by up to 60%. So, we're going to dig into this, but before we get there, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the CEO of the award-winning PR tech firm Technica Communications and the founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. Before building those organizations, I was an award-winning reporter for NPR and PBS, and I covered things like environmental science, healthcare, and education. And if this is your first or 50th time tuning in, I want to say welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. It is our joy and pleasure to bring these stories to you. I've told many people it's my creative outlet, so thank you for listening. And if you'd like to get more involved in our community, there's a couple ways you can do that. Obviously, the next time you're talking about podcasts with a friend or you're referencing something you learned from the show, please feel free to let your friends know that you heard it from Earthlings 2.0. That is the single most effective way you can help build our listenership and build our community. If you've already done that, or if you want to do more, you can follow us on social media, Earthlings Pod, on all the channels. You can send me an email and tell me how you think I'm doing, Lisa Ann at earthlingspodcast.com. I am willing to take any criticism you might have of the show. I got no editors. I'm my editor, so get out your red pen. Let me know what you think. And there's also a listener survey if you want to be more anonymous. You can find that in the show notes and on our website, earthlingspodcast.com. And if you're feeling financially generous, you can go over to Patreon. That's in our show notes. Become a contributing member of the show for only $5 a month, which is the $5 you're probably going to spend on coffee anyway. You can get extended interviews and early drops of episodes before other folks in the community. And thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. Today's Tech Spotlight is with Rhythmos. They say their technology leverages a combination of things like AI, machine learning, and advanced data analytics, and they couple that with power engineering expertise to provide grid edge technologies that help utilities tackle these growing complexities that I mentioned of grid optimization, like renewable energy integration and also just electrification with EVs. So joining us to explore this is Ken Munson. He's the CEO, and he has over 2 decades of experience in the energy sector, including co-founding Sunverge Energy, and he has dedicated his career to developing scalable technologies that drive modernization and efficiency. And we're catching up with him from his home office in Montana. Ken, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. That's quite an opening. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start out our conversation around this gap that you recognized that was in the market and you thought you could solve it with what now you've built, Rhythmos. So, what's this gap and how are you addressing it?
Well, it actually goes back to the days when we had co-founded Sunverge Energy back in 2007, 2008 timeframe, and the learning that we took away, having operated that company, at least while I was CEO for almost 11 years, 10, 11 years. And one of the things that we saw was the increasing complexity that utilities are challenged with in characterizing and identifying loads below the meter. And back in the day, if you will, it was somewhat static. It was a thermostat, or it was a solar on the roof, or it was a battery in the garage, emerging battery in the garage, because that's still emerging today. But as the markets have evolved and we've moved toward this, through this energy transition, electric vehicles are the headline. And I would still argue, even with all the administrative turmoil that we've got going on in today's markets, that EVs will continue to play an important role in this energy transition. One of the unique things about electric vehicles is that they are mobile, right? They have different complexities associated. They're not static. They charge at different times. There's different sizes. And so we saw a great opportunity to help utilities identify and characterize this new load. And it is a pretty significant load. If you think about it, as you said in your opening monologue, by 2035, electric vehicles will represent 27% of all the vehicles in the US. And that translates into, effectively a 14 to $19 billion problem, as you mentioned, in service transformer upgrades by 2030. But if you go further than that, if you continue on the electrification trend, that could balloon to as high as $47 billion by 2035. So it is very significant. That translates, that 27% translates into approximately 78.5 million vehicles on the road with 42.5 million charging points. And so the addressable market for this from a utility perspective and from a load growth perspective is significant. So that's how we got started. And it's evolved from there. With electric vehicles being at the forefront of the way we founded the company, and again, creating transparency for the utility to identify these vehicles, it's evolved into having a much more nuanced understanding of what assets are impacted by that load, both spatially, so or locationally, and temporally over time. And that's really the sweet spot that we've kind of settled into today.
As I understand it, it's pretty difficult for utilities to know what, when and where EVs are charging on their grids unless that EV is participating perhaps in a special rate for the charging of the EV, and you're helping these utilities identify these aspects even faster.
That's correct. Traditional programs that utilities run for electric vehicles are typically opt-in programs. It's sort of like a marketing campaign. There's a carrot, which is some sort of marketing tool that's used to solicit an electric vehicle, a new owner, often in times with in concert with the OEM of the car that they've purchased, to get them to join into a time of use tariff. And that's the incentive for the utility. That's under a traditional, what we call managed charging program. But there are a lot of these programs that aren't as effective as they could be. And so we saw a unique opportunity to go in and use the data that almost every utility has today. It's not fully 100%, but a large percent of utilities today have smart meters. Today, advanced metering infrastructure is used primarily for billing, but we saw an opportunity to go further than that, tap into that data and use that data to help characterize the load. So our algorithms will look at the very specific load profile among all of the other load profiles that meter is characterizing. We'll identify an electric vehicle, and then we'll present that load and the characteristics of that load, both in space and time, to the utility for them to act upon.
What do you help them do to act upon that new load after it's been identified?
The primary platform that Rhythmos has created, called Cadency AI, is really designed to not only, as we've talked about, identify where the electric vehicles are, but specifically identify where that load is in space and time and the specific assets that it's impacting. And so we effectively identify the latent capacity on the distribution network. So outside of that traditional time of use rate structure, exists a lot of flexibility to do a lot of different things around charging a vehicle. But time of use tends to be very specific, only charge between the hours of 9 and 12 p.m. as an illustration. Well, you have all of these other hours for which uh, you can manage that load. And it's in that dynamic operating envelope that we generate a signal for the utility that then sends to its charge point operators, to its fleet managers, through its programs, whether that be through its advanced distribution management systems, their DERMS, or their ADMS platforms. And there is a lot of optimization within that ecosystem. In other words, there are smart platforms that optimize the driver's performance, they optimize the car's performance, they may do a combination and optimize around route performance. They may, in fact, just optimize on the battery itself. But they all came back to one point. They all came back to optimization against a price signal, a time of use price signal. And it's within that gap between the utility head-end systems and below the meter that we saw that opportunity to create transparency, to create visibility so that you could tap into that latent capacity. And that's what the signal does. So back to the first part of your question, what we're really doing is setting ourselves up to plug into anyone downstream and anyone upstream so that VPP players, companies that are involved in aggregation of DER assets that don't necessarily have network expertise or network visibility, we simply plug and deliver the signal to them. It can come directly from us, or on the other hand, if a utility has a DERMS application that they've spent years putting in place, why have them replace it with another system? Why not just give them the visibility, give them the tool set so that you can light touch, light integrate over the data that they're already using, and then have them deliver it downstream. So that's the kind of the core thinking about what we want to be. Light touch, easy to deploy, a fraction of the cost of what a utility has spent in these large systems, enabling all players to kind of rise for more value. And ultimately where you end up with that is, creating a win-win for the ratepayer and society as a whole by lowering utility costs that translate into stable rates for consumers, by optimizing to prevent failure so that resiliency is improved, ensuring reliability, and adding, going back to that, average utility scenario. An average utility of 250,000 meters has the opportunity to save upwards of $7 to $9 billion in projected savings kind of going forward. So it can be pretty significant.
And that's why I really appreciated reading your white paper, which you authored with this consulting firm, Energy and Environmental Economics, or known as E3. And you outlined how EV charging optimization could cut transformer upgrade costs by up to like 60% in some high demand areas. So, what was the research and data that you had that led you to this conclusion?
We have a utility in the Southeast, a small cooperative that's part of a larger G&T that effectively we had won an EPRI award through and demonstrated our product in our first year of operation. And so that was a big win for us. Technically, we got a chance to prove it. But the second layer that came, what happened in the deployment itself, kind of the measurement and verification stage of our technology. And that's where we looked to bring E3 back and have them do an independent study and really okay, look at a couple of things. Here's the results from the study at this smaller utility in the Southeast with frankly lower EV penetration rates. What do we think the impact would be? And we were able to set that as a baseline. But then the begging question or the nagging question was, what would that look like under a regulated scenario? So we chose Southern California Edison. as a rate case, and we let them do their thing. And effectively, after about a 4 or 5 month study, they were able to apply the logic and extend the logic into a what if this rate was applied on a national basis, for us to be able to then look at what would be the true impact kind of across the industry. And so you can look at a particular utility, and in our case, in this study's case, you might conclude that, well, it has the potential to save $1,000 per uh, transformer. And by itself, that might be okay. That's interesting. The average transformer can range from 25 to $50,000 or more, depending on the size. Um, but it's still kind of negligible, right? Until you break it down and you think about how many transformers are actually in a service territory for an average utility. And as I mentioned before, on a national basis, there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions of transformers that actually exist. And when you begin to apply that $1,000 savings across different rate structures and across different utilities, you can see that the significance of that report and the quantification of that value, um, becomes incredibly important. And that's really what we wanted to accomplish. We had not seen in the industry really any study that had addressed the specific transformer value. And there are, again, there's a lot of people doing really important work, even people we compete against in the space. But there seemed to be more hand waving, with no judgment to those others. There seemed to be more hand waving around the potential value rather than the explicit value that could be derived. And that was really what we wanted to publish in that, or get to that finding and publish for the industry. And I think they accomplished that. So we're really proud that our platform was analyzed. It's quote unquote kind of a bake off, if you will, to make sure that the real value is there. And now it's up to us to continue to evangelize that savings. And so when you look back, and what was demonstrated was that in an unmanaged charging environment, managed charging does a good job by itself, just straight managed charging. So that's simply using the time of use rate structure with active management to curtail charging, or to promote charging at specific times. But when you begin to use optimized charging and move beyond kind of that passive structure, you're able to almost double. You are able to double the savings. And what we were able to demonstrate is almost a 60% savings. And that can be thought of in another way. You're almost doubling the capacity of electric vehicles that a utility can bring onto that existing network without modernization, right? Which has a huge implication for capital flexibility, right? Their ability to defer investment in that network and optimize that network to achieve, its maximum potential.
And this trickles down to the rate cases that they might put up with their regulatory bodies, and then the rate increases that individuals might experience on their bill. If these utilities are optimizing their charging, then those costs are going to be lower across the board.
I mean, that's ultimately the way it happens, right? The more money you put into something, someone has to pay for it. And so, most often it either translates into one of two charges. So if you think about it in a investor-owned utility, it translates into an increase in rates. If you look at below the meter partners like fleet operators, it translates into a pass down of a service charge due to that fleet surpassing the capacity of that transformer, and therefore that transformer at that site has to be upgraded, and that cost gets passed down to the fleet operator.
And beyond the cost of the transformer, as I understand it, they there's not many of them available, and so you have to wait a long time to get one.
Transformers, there is a supply chain. There has been a supply chain constraint in effect for some time. That will, mostly since COVID, that will vary from region of the country. But generally speaking, we've moved as an industry away, and we're talking about averages now, away from a 16-week to 24-week lead time up into the 72 or 172-week lead time. And because of raw material constraints in the same, again, talking about averages, you have seen utility, or excuse me, transformer costs increase, in some cases more than quadruple in cost. So it can be expensive for utilities to just simply blindly, and I use that term lightly, but without specificity, um, simply upgrade their network. Now, let me back up. There are power estimation studies that are done on an annual and sometimes biannual basis. It varies by utility. There are different tool sets. It's not as though utilities don't know what those assets are doing. That would be a mischaracterization. Um, However, what we've been able to do by bringing this platform to market is we can actually, in a much lighter way, address the assessment of that capacity on those assets. And I will stop short of saying real time because that's not true, but in near real time scenarios on a much more frequent basis. We could do it every day. We could do it every 5 days. We could do it once a month. The reality is it can be done much more frequently with less resource from the utility in an automated way than your traditional power flow studies that are done that have looked that may be done on a biannual or annual basis, right? So we've tried to introduce that efficiency into the market so that as vehicle adoption continues, and in some states and counties, you do see a rapid increase. You can see a marked change in the penetration of electric vehicles quarter over quarter. California is a perfect example of that. And to be able to stay current with that demand puts you in the driver's seat as opposed to waking up one day and realizing there's going to be a challenge with a set of assets on a particular circuit.
That dynamicism I can see could be really attractive. So, looking to the future, where do you see this type of optimized managed charging moving forward with utilities? What can we expect in the next, say, 10 years in terms of how utilities are going to start addressing this opportunity more directly?
Well, I won't put a time frame on it. um,
Knowing how slow utilities move.
well, but I will say that I think, you know, given the conversation, kind of going back to the way things have just begun to precipitously change and evolve much faster, the availability and access to data in highly actionable, um, impactful ways, actionable and impactful ways, is going to be so much easier for utilities to access, right? And whether it's directly through a platform like ours, or if it's through a combination of platforms, which I in fact believe is kind of the silver bullet. The silver bullet is an ecosystem of technologies working very closely together, solving different aspects of a big challenge. Um, but the one point that I want to leave you with is that at the end of the day, if the grid cannot absorb that demand, that is your single point of failure. And so as we look forward, the challenge that we think we are trying to solve, along with others, but we think we're at the forefront of this, is really optimization of grid assets to increase the rate of renewable adoption so that it doesn't break, or that it doesn't cost $4.2 trillion for modernization to occur, as some agencies have claimed, going forward.
Yeah, when sometimes I wonder if those those big numbers are like a scare tactic to get people to just throw up their hands and like, oh, it's going to be too hard. Let's not do it.
It could be. I mean, it could be. I'm not one to be an expert on that, but I will share that there are quite a few statistics that show that the grid supporting both transmission and distribution in the United States has been sorely undercapitalized since the 70s, and will continue to need further capitalization. And at the end of the day, who's to say what that number will be? But it will most likely be a big one.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
And thank you to Earthlings for joining us today. We'll see you again on another turn of this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.